"I just need someone at my wife's funeral," 85-year-old Walter Osgood said, tears running freely down a face that hadn't cried in front of a stranger in longer than he could remember. He'd walked straight across a gas station lot to a man he'd never met in his life, drawn by nothing more than the sight of a leather cut that reminded him, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, of men he'd once served beside. 61 years of marriage, and he'd just spent the morning arranging a funeral he feared almost no one would attend. Miles Kavanagh set down the fuel nozzle without finishing the tank and gave Walter his full attention. What Miles did with that request over the next 48 hours would end with 200 Hells Angels filling a church built to hold 80. Cedarville, Tennessee was small enough that its one funeral home handled most of the county's services, a converted Victorian house on Main Street with a wraparound porch and a chapel that could seat, at absolute capacity, roughly 80 people. Its pews original to the building, and its stained glass windows donated decades ago by families whose names still meant something to the handful of longtime residents left in town. Walter Osgood had walked out of that funeral home an hour before Miles ever saw him, having just finished arranging his wife Doris's service for that Saturday, and had crossed the street to the gas station on foot afterward, simply because he hadn't wanted to get back in his truck yet, unsure his hands were steady enough for the 10-minute drive home. Needing a few minutes just to stand somewhere that wasn't either the funeral home or the empty house waiting for him. Miles Kavanagh had ridden with the local Hells Angels chapter for 19 years, and had stopped at that same gas station most mornings on his way to the machine shop he owned 2 miles further down Main Street, a routine so consistent that the station's owner kept his usual coffee order ready before Miles even reached the counter most days. At 44, Miles had buried his own father 3 years earlier and still remembered exactly how thin the crowd at that service had felt. A handful of co-workers and 2 cousins scattered across pews built for 80, the echo of his own footsteps in the aisle afterward, a memory that surfaced immediately the moment Walter said the word funeral. Before we get to what Miles did with that request, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels tonight. I read every single one of them. Now, back to that gas station lot, where an 85-year-old man's quiet fear was about to become the reason 200 motorcycles filled Cedarville's Main Street by Saturday morning, and the reason a widower who thought he'd bury his wife alone would instead do it surrounded by more people than he'd stood among in a decade. Walter and Doris Osgood had been married 61 years, meeting at a church social the summer after Walter came home from 2 tours with the Army, married within 8 months once Walter's own mother had approved, and had raised 1 son together in the same house Walter still lived in alone. Doris had spent 30 years teaching 3rd grade at the elementary school 2 blocks from that same house, and half of Cedarville's adults under 60 had learned their multiplication tables from her at some point, though most of them had moved away or lost touch over the decades since. Doris had suffered a massive stroke 11 days earlier, dying in the hospital 4 days later without ever regaining the ability to speak. And Walter had spent every one of those 4 days at her bedside, holding a hand that could no longer hold his back, talking to her about nothing in particular because the nurses had told him hearing was often the last sense to go. He had outlived nearly everyone else who might have filled a pew for her, his own service buddies gone one by one over the past 2 decades, the last of them, a man named Grady he'd served alongside in Vietnam, passing just 18 months earlier. Doris's closest friends from church having passed within the last several years themselves, one after another, until the 2 of them had simply lived long enough to become the last ones standing in most of the rooms they used to fill, outlasting an entire generation of the people who used to know them best. Their son Peter had moved overseas 11 years earlier for work, settling in Singapore with a family of his own, and while the relationship between father and son had never been unfriendly, exactly, It had thinned considerably with distance and time zones, reduced mostly to holiday calls and the occasional visit every year or two, each one shorter than Walter would have liked, and neither of them quite sure how to say so out loud. When Doris died, Peter had immediately booked the first flight he could find, canceling meetings and leaving his own family scrambling to cover for him on short notice. But a mechanical delay and a missed connection in Tokyo had left him stranded for an extra day, uncertain himself whether he'd make it back in time for the service at all. A fact that had sat with Walter like one more loss, stacked on top of the one he was already trying to survive. Unable to shake the fear that he might end up burying his wife without either his son or a single old friend in the room. The funeral director, a kind man named Ellison, who'd known the Osgoods for decades, having grown up 2 streets over from them as a boy, had asked Walter gently that morning how many guests to expect for seating purposes, a routine question that had landed on Walter harder than Ellison could have known. Walter had done the math in his head, standing right there in the man's office. No service buddies left living, Doris's church friends gone. A handful of distant cousins who hadn't spoken to either of them in years, and a son who might not even make it. He'd told Ellison to plan for 15, maybe 20, watching Ellison's face carefully for any sign of pity he didn't think he could bear that morning, and had walked out of that building feeling, for the first time in 61 years of marriage, that he might actually bury his wife in front of an almost empty room. He didn't plan to say anything to the stranger gassing up his motorcycle across the street. He'd simply found himself walking that direction, without fully deciding to. The pull of the leather cut and the low idle of the engine tugging at some memory he couldn't quite name, and once he was standing close enough, the words came out before he'd thought through what he meant to ask. "I just need someone at my wife's funeral," he said, the tears arriving with the sentence rather than before it, his hands trembling at his sides. "I don't have anybody left to fill the seats. I know that's a strange thing to ask a stranger. I just didn't know who else to ask." Miles didn't hesitate. "I'll be there," he said, setting the fuel nozzle back in its cradle without bothering to finish topping off his tank. "What time and where?" Walter blinked at him, startled by how quickly the answer had come, as though he'd braced himself for a polite excuse rather than an immediate yes. "Saturday," he said. 10 in the morning. Ellison's, on Main." Miles nodded once. "Firm. I'll be there," he said again, "and I'm not coming alone." Miles called his chapter president that same afternoon, explaining what had happened in a voice that made clear this wasn't a request he was making lightly, and the president, hearing enough of the details, didn't ask a single follow-up question before saying yes. Word moved through the chapter within hours, and by evening, Miles had made calls to 2 neighboring chapters as well. Each conversation carrying the same simple fact that seemed to need no further justification. An 85-year-old veteran was about to bury his wife of 61 years in front of an almost empty room. And that wasn't happening if riders within driving distance had anything to say about it. By Thursday, word had reached chapters 3 states away, forwarded through group chats and phone trees the way this kind of story always seemed to travel fastest. A regional coordinator who ran a veterans outreach page shared Walter's story, careful to leave out identifying details until Miles confirmed with Walter that he was comfortable with it being shared more widely, describing simply an elderly veteran facing his wife's funeral with almost no one left to attend, and Walter, still stunned that a single stranger had said yes so readily, agreed without fully grasping yet how far the story had already traveled, or how many people were already making plans to be there Saturday morning. Engines. That was the sound filling Cedarville's Main Street before 8 that Saturday morning, 2 hours before the service was scheduled to start. Riders parking in careful rows that stretched 3 blocks past the funeral home in both directions, engines cutting to silence one after another until the street fell into a hush that felt, several residents said afterward, almost like its own kind of tribute. 200 Hell's Angels filled every pew in the little chapel and stood along the walls and out the front doors onto the porch once the seats ran out, spilling into the street itself. All of them there for a woman almost none of them had ever met, and a man most of them hadn't known existed a week earlier. Ellison, who'd been quietly worried all week about exactly the opposite problem, spent the morning finding extra folding chairs and finally gave up, propping every door open so the overflow crowd outside could hear the service through speakers a member had brought and set up without being asked, running cable out to the porch himself before anyone had to ask him to. A local reporter, who'd caught wind of the gathering from a neighbor's phone call, stood at the edge of the crowd taking photographs, later telling her editor that she'd covered a lot of funerals in her career and had never once seen a street that full for someone the mourners themselves had mostly never met. A line that ended up as the opening sentence of the story that ran in the county paper that Monday and was picked up by 2 larger outlets within the week. Walter stood at the front of that packed chapel in a suit he hadn't worn since Doris's sister's funeral a decade earlier, and when he turned around before the service began to see 200 strangers filling a room built for 80, his legs went unsteady enough that Miles crossed the aisle to stand beside him, one hand under his elbow, the way you'd steady an old friend rather than a man you'd known for 4 days. Peter Osgood landed at the regional airport 40 minutes before the service started, having made a connection in Denver he genuinely believed impossible the night before, running through the terminal with a garment bag over one shoulder and a rental car reservation he barely had time to confirm. He walked into a church so full of leather and chrome that he stood in the doorway a full 10 seconds before he understood what he was looking at, scanning the packed pews for his father's face among 200 strangers. He found Walter at the front, and the 2 of them held on to each other longer than either had in years. Peter whispering an apology for the distance, for the years of holiday-only phone calls, for almost not making it at all, and Walter telling him, through tears that had finally turned from grief to something closer to overwhelmed gratitude, that he'd made it, and that was all that mattered now. The service itself ran long, riders standing quietly through all of it, despite most of them never having met Doris Osgood, several wiping their own eyes during a eulogy Peter delivered on almost no sleep and less preparation, describing a mother who'd kept the porch light on every night of his childhood so his father would always find his way home safely, and who'd taught 3rd grade for 30 years because she believed every single child deserved at least one adult who remembered their name correctly, a detail that struck an entire church full of riders who understood exactly what it meant to ride home to someone who left a light on. Miles and a dozen other members escorted the procession to the cemetery afterward, 200 motorcycles trailing a single hearse down Main Street at a walking pace, businesses along the route stepping outside to watch the procession pass in a silence that felt entirely unlike the noise 200 motorcycles usually made, and stood in careful formation around the grave site, while Walter said his final goodbye to a woman he'd loved for 61 years, surrounded by more people than either of them had probably stood among in a decade. Walter has a standing invitation to the local chapter's Sunday breakfast now, and rarely misses one, showing up most weeks in the same suit jacket he wore to the funeral until Miles finally convinced him he was welcome in a flannel shirt just as easily. Peter has changed his return flight twice since the funeral, staying 3 weeks longer than he'd planned, and has since arranged to bring his own family back to Cedarville twice a year rather than let the distance between them and his father grow the way it had before, his own children video calling their grandfather most Sundays now at Peter's insistence. Miles checks in on Walter most Wednesdays, and the 2 of them have taken to sitting on Walter's porch some evenings, the same porch light Doris used to leave on now burning most nights out of habit rather than necessity. Walter telling stories about Doris that Miles makes a point of remembering, certain that a woman who mattered that much deserves to keep being talked about. An 85-year-old veteran asked a stranger for one thing: someone to stand with him while he said goodbye. 200 bikers made sure he never had to stand alone again, that day or any day after. If you believe no one should have to grieve in an empty room, tell us where you're watching from tonight. I read every comment.